The chamber was thick with tension, cameras humming, eyes locked on the young man who carried a last name that had divided America for nearly a decade. Barron Trump leaned forward, lips curling into a smirk that carried the arrogance of dynasty. And then, with a voice sharpened like a blade, he spat the word that would ignite the storm. Unfit, the air cracked. Conversations froze. You could feel the weight of the insult roll across the room like a thunderclap. Unfit, not just a dismissal of Jasmine Crockett's position, but of her identity, her struggle, her place in the halls of power. In that single syllable, privilege sneered at perseverance. Youth mocked experience. Dynasty tried to stamp out dignity. Crockett sat still, her expression unreadable. To some, she seemed cornered. To others, wounded. But if you looked closer, beyond the practiced calm, you could see the flicker of something Barron had failed to recognize. A woman who had been underestimated her entire life and who had learned, time and again, to turn insults into fuel. The cameras zoomed in, eager to catch the fallout. Reporters scribbled furiously, already drafting headlines that would echo across the evening broadcasts. Barron Trump brands Crockett unfit. It was the kind of moment designed to humiliate, to remind her and everyone watching of who supposedly held power. But then something strange happened. The silence stretched. The crowd expected outrage, a retort, maybe even tears. Instead, Crockett did nothing. She let the word hang there, suspended, heavy. She let Barron believe he had one. And then, almost imperceptibly, her hand moved toward a folder resting on the desk in front of her. Time seemed to slow. Her composure was unsettling, her stillness more powerful than any immediate rebuttal. And while Barron leaned back in smug satisfaction, unaware of the trap he'd walked into, the rest of the room began to sense that something far more dramatic was about to unfold, because what came next would not only silence Barron Trump, it would leave his supporters shaken, his critics electrified, and an entire nation glued to their screens, because no one expected Jasmine Crockett to have a recording that could flip the script so completely. The setting was no ordinary chamber, no backroom argument lost in the churn of politics. This was a committee hearing broadcast live, every angle captured by cameras that turned public service into theater. The fluorescent lights were merciless, exposing every twitch, every smirk, every bead of sweat. For Barron Trump, it was a stage he relished, another arena to flex his name, his inheritance, the aura of inevitability that followed him. For Jasmine Crockett, it was a battlefield where every word carried the weight of her journey, her community, her people. The insult unfit stung not only because of its delivery, but because of the subtext that clung to it. It was more than a critique of her readiness. It was a dismissal of her legitimacy. Crockett wasn't just facing Barron in that moment. She was staring down the centuries-old specter of power wielded to silence women, to silence immigrants' daughters, to silence those who didn't come from dynasties. When Barron sneered, he carried the entitlement of a gilded name. When Crockett sat still, she carried the weight of survival. The lessons of clawing her way into rooms people told her she didn't belong in. Viewers across America felt it in real time. To some, the insult was entertainment, another viral clip to meme into oblivion. But to millions more, it landed like a slap across the face. They saw in Crockett a reflection of their own battles at work, in classrooms, in the eyes of those who underestimated them. Barron's single word was a megaphone for every time dignity had been dismissed, and yet Crockett did not rise to the bait. She didn't hurl back insults. She didn't flinch. Instead, she let silence work like a slow fuse, and the room began to sense what Barron could not. Jasmine Crockett wasn't cornered. She was calculating behind the calm exterior. Crockett was preparing something that would tilt the balance. Tucked inside her folder was the kind of revelation that could change not just the mood in the chamber, but the narrative outside it. It wasn't a speech or a retort. It was something heavier, sharper, undeniable. As the seconds ticked by, Barron doubled down. He gestured with his hands, dismissive, talking over her presence with the ease of someone who believed lineage was argument enough. He had the swagger of dynasty, convinced experience could be mocked into irrelevance. But viewers watching from living rooms, from phones and crowded subway cars, from classrooms where young people searched for role models, could see the imbalance. One side spoke from arrogance. The other prepared to speak from truth. The tension was electric. Every camera tightened its frame on Crockett. Every journalist in the room sensed the possibility of history being made. And while Barron smiled for the flashbulbs, Jasmine Crockett reached slowly for that folder again. Her hand hovered, steady, patient. No one in the chamber could know what it contained. No one in America watching at home could predict the twist about to unfold. But as the cameras rolled, Crockett wasn't just sitting. Silently, she was preparing a move. No one could anticipate to understand the venom. Behind Barron Trump's word, "unfit," you have to step back and look at the world that shaped him. For most Americans, life is a ladder, each rung earned through scraped knuckles and sleepless nights. For Barron, life was an elevator with gilded doors, carrying him upward without effort. He was born into the glittering halls of the Trump dynasty, surrounded not by the hum of sacrifice but by the constant hum of cameras, security details, and unshakable privilege. From the very beginning, Barron was more than a child. He was a brand extension. The nation met him not as a student or a neighbor, but as the youngest son of a president who reveled in spectacle. His image was carefully protected, his appearances carefully staged. He never knew the anonymity of walking into a classroom without whispers, the ordinary struggle of applying for a summer job, the awkward humility of waiting for your turn. In the Trump orbit, you were always first in line, because others were trained to step aside. By the time he entered young adulthood, Barron carried himself like someone who had never heard the word no without a safety net to cushion it. His wealth and name were armor, shielding him from consequences that would crush anyone else. He could speak with arrogance because he had never been forced to speak with humility. He could dismiss opponents because he had never been forced to earn allies. In Barron's world, entitlement wasn't an attitude, it was oxygen. When he looked at Jasmine Crockett across that committee room, he didn't just see a rival. He saw someone who broke the unspoken order. He saw a woman who came from nothing, daring to claim space in a world his family believed they owned. His smirk, his sneer, his word unfit were not spontaneous. They were rehearsed behaviors, honed in a family where dominance was sport and belittling others was strategy. But arrogance has a tell. It always leaks in the way someone interrupts. It's the way someone rolls their eyes when challenged, the way someone assumes their perspective is the only one that matters. Barron's public image reflected that pattern perfectly. He was polished but brittle, confident but hollow. He mistook applause for respect, headlines for credibility, and power for character. His dismissiveness was legendary in the circles he moved through. Whether it was mocking the credentials of those with decades of experience or brushing off critics with a practiced shrug, Barron acted as though disagreement was beneath him. And that's why, when he called Crockett unfit, he believed he was simply delivering another effortless putdown. The kind of remark that would earn a quick laugh from supporters and silence from opponents, but outside the bubble of his dynasty, Americans were growing tired of this pattern. They saw a young man who had inherited power, but never earned wisdom. They saw someone insulated from the struggles of ordinary life, no student loans, no bills piling up, no nights working double shifts. They saw someone who could afford arrogance because he had never tasted defeat. And that was the contrast that made this clash so gripping. Crockett's every word was forged in the fires of perseverance, while Barron's every word floated on the air of entitlement. He had never had to claw his way through skepticism or fight to be taken seriously in a room that didn't want him there. His insults came cheap because they cost him nothing. Her dignity, by contrast, had been paid for with every rejection she'd turned into resilience. That's why the insult carried such weight, not because Barron spoke it, but because of who he was when he spoke it. The heir to privilege calling a fighter unfit was the perfect picture of arrogance clashing with authenticity. And while he smirked, certain he had claimed the moment, he had no idea he was laying the groundwork for his own unraveling. Because Barron Trump's story was one of silver spoons and padded landings, Jasmine Crockett's story was written in fire, not silver spoons. Before the cameras, before the headlines, before the word unfit echoed across America. Jasmine Crockett's story was unfolding in places where few ever thought greatness would be born. She was raised not in the marble lobbies of New York high-rises, but in working-class neighborhoods where people measured wealth not in dollars, but in resilience. Her parents worked hard and expected her to do the same, instilling in her a belief that dignity was never something handed down, it was something earned every single day. As a child, Jasmine knew what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers would glance at her and assume limits. Classmates, fueled by stereotypes and ignorance, doubted her potential. But instead of folding under the weight of low expectations, she turned each slight into motivation. Every dismissive glance became a spark. Every you can't became a vow. Watch me. Books became her armor, education her rebellion. She pushed herself through long nights of study, the kind where exhaustion blurred the words, but determination carried her forward. When other kids were told success was a possibility, Jasmine lived as though success was her responsibility. She knew that breaking barriers wasn't just about her own future, it was about opening doors for those who would come after. Law was the natural battlefield for someone like her. She saw injustice firsthand. Friends targeted unfairly, families broken apart by systems designed to favor the powerful. She chose the law not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Every case she took on was a fight against a tide of cynicism. Courtrooms became arenas where she stood, small in stature, but towering in conviction, ready to face opponents who doubted her before she even spoke. And yet, time and again, she proved them wrong. She would walk into hearings where her credentials were questioned, only to leave with victories that changed lives. She faced off against seasoned lawyers who dismissed her as inexperienced, only to dismantle their arguments with precision. Each win wasn't just professional, it was personal. Every triumph was a declaration. I belong here. Politics came next, not because she sought the spotlight, but because the fights were bigger than any one courtroom. She carried the same grit into the political arena, where whispers of doubt followed her. Too young, too outspoken, too different, they said. But those labels only added fuel. She campaigned with raw honesty, meeting people where they lived, listening to voices ignored by others. Her victories were never inevitable. They were earned through sweat, sacrifice, and the courage to stand firm when the odds tilted against her. By the time Jasmine Crockett entered Congress, she had been underestimated 1,000 times. She had walked into rooms where eyes rolled before she spoke. She had been told you don't belong in a dozen different ways. And yet here she was, not because of privilege, but because of persistence. Every bruise, every dismissal, every insult had carved steel into her spine. That history was alive in the committee room when Barron Trump called her unfit. What he thought was a clever jab was, for her, a familiar echo. She had heard it before, from teachers, from colleagues, from doubters who had long since been proven wrong. And if history had taught her anything, it was that insults were not roadblocks, they were accelerants. Viewers who watched her in that moment saw more than a politician. They saw themselves. The immigrant child told they would never be American enough. The young professional dismissed in boardrooms despite their talent. The parent juggling 2 jobs, hearing whispers that they weren't doing enough. Crockett became a vessel for all of them. Her silence in the face of Barron's sneer wasn't weakness. It was strength forged in years of rising above. She carried not just her own story, but the stories of countless people who had been overlooked, underestimated, written off. That's why her calm unnerved Barron so deeply. He mistook silence for surrender, when in truth, it was the gathering of a storm built from childhood doubts, from courtroom battles, from campaign trails where every door slammed became another door she forced open. Every hardship, every rejection, every uphill climb had been training for this moment. And as she sat there, steady and composed, she wasn't just facing Barron Trump, she was facing down the arrogance of privilege itself. So when Barron Trump sneered the word unfit, he had no idea the storm she was about to unleash. The room had not recovered from the sting of Barron Trump's insult when he leaned back in his chair, stretching the silence into something unbearable. He wore the look of a man convinced he had landed the decisive blow. It's a kind of smug expression that seemed less like confidence and more like entitlement set in stone. But silence can be deceiving, and in that silence, the battle was only beginning. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras adjusted their focus, and everyone waited for Jasmine Crockett to snap. They wanted fire, a sharp retort. Something loud enough to match the sting of UNFIT. But Crockett didn't give them the satisfaction. She sat, eyes steady, hands folded, every inch of her body language screaming restraint. The contrast was sharp, barren, restless, performing for the room. Crockett.com, watching, calculating. Barron mistook her quiet for weakness. He leaned forward again, words dripping with dismissive arrogance. "You know, I just don't think you've earned the right to be here," he said, waving his hand as though brushing her out of existence. He rolled his eyes, chuckled under his breath, and let the arrogance spill into every gesture. His posture wasn't just disrespect, it was theater, meant to provoke, meant to humiliate. The audience could feel it, the escalation, the tightening of the air. Viewers at home were caught between outrage and anticipation, the kind of tension that pulls you to the edge of your seat. Would she break? Would she shout back? Would she let the insult pass unanswered? But Jasmine Crockett didn't rise to his level. She didn't trade jab for jab. Instead, she allowed him to keep digging. Every scoff, every dismissive shrug, every arrogant glance across the chamber only made him look smaller while she grew stronger in stillness. Crockett understood something Barron never had to learn. Sometimes silence is louder than shouting. You could almost hear the heartbeat of the room, a collective pulse of suspense. Social media was already buzzing, phones lighting up with live reactions. Hashtags forming, debates breaking out in real time. Some viewers were furious, demanding she shut him down immediately. Others urged patience, sensing she was holding something back. A countermove simmering just beneath the surface. Barron, oblivious to the trap he was setting for himself, leaned into the arrogance harder. He listed off supposed flaws, mocked her credentials, gestured toward his own family's legacy as if it were proof of authority. Each word was another brick in the wall he was building around himself. A wall that would soon collapse under its own weight. Crockett simply adjusted her papers, her gaze unwavering. She knew better than to interrupt a man destroying his own case. She let the cameras linger on his sneer while she preserved her dignity. In that moment, the contrast was undeniable. One born into power, flaunting it recklessly. The other forged in struggle, wielding patience like a blade. The tension swelled. Even those who doubted her at first began to sense that something monumental was coming. It was in the steadiness of her hands, the calm of her breathing, the quiet confidence that filled the space between Barron's insults. Crockett wasn't outmatched. She was waiting, and then, as Barron finished another dismissive tirade and leaned back with a smirk that suggested victory, Jasmine Crockett moved. Her hands slid across the table, deliberate and steady, toward the folder she had guarded so carefully. The room stilled. Reporters froze mid-sentence. The camera snapped into tight focus. She opened the folder, withdrew a small device, and set it gently on the table. Barron frowned, confused, his smirk faltering for the first time. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With the press of a single button, she had the power to shift the balance of the entire confrontation. And then, she pressed play. The chamber fell into a heavy silence as Jasmine Crockett's finger hovered above the button. Barron Trump shifted uneasily, though his smirk still lingered, confident that nothing she could reveal would touch him. For him, silence was dominance. Arrogance was armor. But for Crockett, silence was the drum roll before the crescendo. And then, with a calmness that seemed almost surgical, she pressed play. At first, the sound that spilled into the room was faint. A man's voice, muffled, hesitant. People leaned in, straining to catch the words. Barron tilted his head, confused, his eyebrows narrowing as if trying to place the sound. The first seconds drew no reaction, just murmurs of curiosity, shifting bodies, reporters scribbling question marks in their notebooks. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat still, allowing the recording to bloom. The voice grew clearer. It was Barron's, his own tone unmistakable, captured in a private conversation never meant to leave the shadows. The words tumbled out with casual arrogance, a mocking dismissal of public service, a sneer at those who wasted their time working their way up instead of being born into power. The chamber reacted instantly. Gasps rippled through the rows, some stifling laughter, others frozen in disbelief. Barron's eyes widened. His lips parted as though to protest, but he said nothing. Midway through, the true weight of the recording settled in. Barron's voice mocked the very people who now sat listening, the lawmakers, the civil servants, the activists. He bragged about influence inherited, not earned. He called the struggles of ordinary Americans irrelevant. He dismissed community leaders, teachers, veterans, even his own peers, as unfit to stand beside him. The hypocrisy was stunning. Laid bare in his own words in the gallery, whispers turned into waves of commentary. Reporters' pens flew, phones captured every second, the sound already finding its way into the bloodstream of social media. Members of the committee exchanged knowing glances, some smirking, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The air was electric with realization. Barron Trump had just condemned himself, and all the while, Jasmine Crockett sat unmoving. Her expression was calm, not triumphant, as though she knew this moment wasn't about gloating, but about truth. She let the recording do the work. Every arrogant syllable, every dismissive phrase, was a self-inflicted wound. By the time the recording reached its final seconds, Barron was visibly unraveling. His face flushed, his smirk gone. He shifted in his chair, tugged at his collar, glared at Crockett with the wild eyes of someone who suddenly realized the ground beneath him was collapsing. He stammered, as if searching for words, but nothing came. The silence between his outbursts on tape and his silence now was deafening. Then, last line of the recording hit like a hammer. Barron's voice, dripping with disdain. People like her will never be fit to lead. The words hung in the air, the very echo of what he had just spat at Crockett minutes earlier. But now, stripped of context, magnified through his own arrogance, it became his undoing. The room erupted. Gasps, muttered disbelief, a few audible chuckles, the kind that spread like wildfire. The contrast was undeniable. The insult he thought would diminish her had transformed into the very evidence that exposed his hollow entitlement. The cameras swiveled back to Crockett. She hadn't moved, hadn't smirked, hadn't gloated. She simply reached forward, paused the recording, and let the silence work its magic. In that silence, the story was no longer about Barron's insult. It was about his collapse. Barron scrambled for footing. That's out of context," he blurted, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. But the room didn't buy it. The smirks, the sidelong glances, the suppressed laughter told the story. Context didn't matter when the arrogance was so perfectly distilled. His power wasn't in his hands anymore. It was in the hands of everyone who had just heard him sneer at the very idea of people earning their way into rooms like this. Crockett finally spoke. Her voice measured, steady, a blade wrapped in velvet. "Congressman," she said, her tone calm yet devastating, "you said I was unfit. I think America just heard who really is." The words landed like a gavel, final, unarguable. The chamber sat stunned, a mix of admiration and disbelief at the composure with which she delivered the blow. The microphones caught every syllable, and within seconds the clip would be cut, edited, and replayed across timelines and broadcasts nationwide. Barron slumped back in his chair, his arrogance leaking away like air from a punctured balloon. He avoided eye contact, his body language betraying the unraveling confidence he so carefully performed minutes earlier. He had been ready to win the headline. Now, he was the headline, and not in the way he wanted. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, didn't need to revel in victory. Her calmness was her victory. She didn't gloat, didn't sneer, didn't mirror the arrogance she had just exposed. She simply let the truth stand, powerful on its own. And in that restraint, she became larger than the room, larger than the moment. She became the embodiment of every Underestimated fighter who had been told you don't belong. Herein chose to answer with dignity instead of venom. The committee hearing was no longer about a policy debate or a partisan skirmish. It had become a morality play, a living parable of privilege versus perseverance, arrogance versus authenticity. And in front of millions of viewers, the tables had turned in a way no one could ignore. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was resonance. It was the kind of silence that told everyone present they had witnessed a shift. The kind of silence that carries weight long after the words have ended. Barron's insult was already fading, a footnote to his own recorded arrogance. Crockett's composure, her patience, her devastating precision that would be remembered. And as the hearing moved on, one truth became undeniable. This was more than a confrontation. This was a cultural moment, a story that would leap beyond the walls of the chamber and ignite a conversation across America. The internet would take this moment and turn it into something even bigger. The hearing may have ended that day, but the story was only beginning. Within minutes of Crockett pressing play, the recording had slipped its leash and raced into the bloodstream of the internet. On Twitter, hashtags bloomed like wildfire, hashtag unfit indeed, hashtag mic drop moment, hashtag Crockett vs. Trump. Memes flooded timelines, side-by-side images of Barron sneering with captions that mocked his arrogance, juxtaposed with Crockett's calm composure, eyes steady, finger on the play button. TikTok edits layered dramatic music over the exact moment Barron's voice condemned him, each one looping endlessly. Replayed by millions who couldn't get enough of watching entitlement implode on itself, by the time the sun set, Crockett's moment had broken through the noise of politics and spilled into pop culture. Influencers who normally avoided political talk jumped on the wave, praising her restraint, her courage, her refusal to descend into the mud. That's how you handle arrogance, one lifestyle vlogger told her audience of millions. That's how you remind people that class isn't bought, it's earned. Commentators across networks dissected every beat. Progressive voices celebrated Crockett as a symbol of resilience. Even some moderates, who often kept their distance from political firestorms, couldn't deny the power of what they'd seen. On late-night comedy shows, Barron's unraveling became fodder for monologues. The clip of him squirming in his chair replayed two peals of audience laughter. But underneath the humor was something sharper. The recognition that this was no ordinary gaffe. This was the dynasty heir exposed as fragile, a prince without armor. Celebrities joined in. Musicians tweeted lyrics about rising above arrogance. Athletes praised Crockett for her composure under pressure. And actors compared the moment to a courtroom drama with a twist ending no screenwriter could have scripted better. The clip was played at award shows after parties, whispered about in green rooms. And by morning, it had been stitched into countless viral remixes. Crockett's calm face became an emblem. Her poise turned into a digital symbol of dignity, striking back against mockery. For Barron, the fallout was brutal. His defenders scrambled to explain away the recording, claiming it was taken out of context or misinterpreted. But context no longer mattered. The image of him mocking service, sneering at struggle, and dismissing people like her was already cemented in the public imagination. Comment threads filled with mockery, memes painted him as a hollow air, a caricature of arrogance unraveling under pressure. His credibility, so carefully staged, took a blow it could not easily recover from. Meanwhile, Crockett's stature grew. She didn't need to post a single meme, didn't need to bask in the moment. Others did it for her. Every clip, every commentary, every remix amplified the same message. Here was a woman who had faced down the dynasty and held her ground with grace. She became a symbol not just of resistance, but of possibility. The idea that even in a system stacked against you, dignity could still pierce privilege. And for millions watching at home, the resonance was personal. Immigrants, workers, students, people who had been told in 1,000 ways that they were unfit to lead or belong, saw themselves in her. They felt the sting of Barron's insult as if it had been directed at them, and they felt the catharsis of Crockett's response as their own vindication. Social media lit up with personal stories. Teachers who had been underestimated, Single parents dismissed by the powerful young activists told they'd never make a difference. "This isn't just her victory," one post read. "This is all of ours." The shockwaves rippled outward into politics itself. Lawmakers who had sat silently during the insult now scrambled to align themselves with Crockett. Editorials declared that the confrontation marked a turning point, not just for her career, but for the larger story of who gets to claim legitimacy in American politics. Barron, once a symbol of dynasty, became a cautionary tale of arrogance undone. Crockett, once underestimated, had become the face of something bigger: the power of preparation, resilience, and truth in the face of mockery. Yet as the dust settled, the deeper question lingered. Beyond the memes and the trending clips, beyond the laughter at Barron's expense, what did this moment truly mean? Why had it resonated so deeply? Because the real power of this moment wasn't just in the takedown, it was in the lesson it left behind. In the quiet after the storm, when the laughter of the internet dulled and the cameras finally turned away, something larger remained. Jasmine Crockett stood not as the victor of a single debate, but as a mirror for millions. The insult that was meant to belittle her had been transformed into a moment of clarity, that worth is not inherited, nor decreed by last names, nor preserved in towers of glass and steel. Worth is proven in the fire, in the struggles overcome, in the battles fought, the dignity carried even when others try to strip it away. Crockett could have met Barron Trump's sneer with anger. She could have lashed out, adding fuel to the spectacle. But instead, she let her restraint speak louder than rage. Her decision to answer arrogance with truth, to fight condescension with composure, made the lesson undeniable. Power without character crumbles. Privilege without empathy collapses. And arrogance, no matter how loud, cannot drown out authenticity. For viewers who had tasted their own share of dismissal, the symbolism was piercing. The single word "unfit" carried the echoes of every time they had been told you don't belong. Every immigrant who had been told they'd never be accepted. Every worker who had been underestimated by a boss. Every young person dismissed as too inexperienced. Every woman told her voice was too sharp, too loud, too inconvenient. In Crockett's steadiness, they saw proof that those insults could be rewritten. That dignity could outlast the sneer. Her victory wasn't measured by Barron's embarrassment, but by the ripple of pride that spread through living rooms. Through group chats, through classrooms and kitchens across the country, people spoke of her as if she had stood for them personally, because in a way she had. She carried the narrative of resilience that countless Americans live daily, turning survival into strength, rejection into resolve. What Barron failed to understand, what privilege often blinds itself from seeing, is that authenticity is unshakable. It does not depend on applause, on dynastic surnames, or on inherited wealth. It's built in late nights, in sacrifices, in the scars of struggle. Crockett's story carried that truth, and when it collided with Barron's arrogance, the result was inevitable. One stood on a pedestal built by others. The other had climbed every rung herself, and so the moral crystallized. Dignity always outlasts arrogance. It may not trend every day. It may not command headlines until the right moment. But when it arrives, it cuts through noise like a bell in the night, impossible to ignore. Crockett showed that the most powerful rebuttal is not shouting louder, but standing taller. This was never just about Barron Trump or Jasmine Crockett. It was about a timeless conflict, privilege versus perseverance, arrogance versus authenticity. And it was about the victory that comes when the underestimated rise. Not with fury, but with undeniable truth. And that's why people everywhere are saying this wasn't just her win, it was ours. Barron Trump called her unfit. He thought the word would silence her, would remind the world who carried the dynasty's name and who did not. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She pressed play, and the recording changed everything. What followed was more than a viral clip. It was a collision of two Americas, one built on entitlement and inherited power, the other built on grit, service, and authenticity. And in that clash, the truth rang louder than arrogance. This is bigger than politics. It's about every time someone tried to write you off, It's about every insult hurled at people who rise from the margins, every sneer thrown at those who refuse to bow to privilege. It's about proving, once and for all, dignity doesn't need a famous last name to stand tall. Crockett's moment is not hers alone. It belongs to everyone who has ever been underestimated and refused to fold. It belongs to you, to me, to the millions who saw themselves in her poise and her strength. And now, it's our turn to carry that message further. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and join the movement of people who know that no matter how loud arrogance gets, it never wins in the end. What wins is truth. What wins is service. What wins is dignity, because when dignity stands tall, arrogance always falls.